Wyoming Territory, late August of 1879. The sun hovered low behind the distant peaks of the Bighorn Mountains, casting long skeletal shadows across the stables at the Callahan Ranch. Wade Callahan, at 38, was a man shaped by the vast, lonely landscape he inhabited. He leaned against a weathered fence post, the woods smooth and gray beneath his calloused hand, and watched her work. She had appeared one morning like a ghost drifting in with the dawn mist. A woman with threadbare clothing, tangled brown hair, and eyes that refused to meet his. She had offered to clean out his stalls, a back-breaking, thankless job in exchange for a hot meal and a few coins. She hadn't haggled or pleaded. She had stated her purpose with a quiet finality that left no room for argument. Wade, who valued work over words, had simply nodded. Now, 5 days later, she had become a silent fixture of his routine. She arrived each morning before the first light, a slim, determined figure moving through the hay and muck without a word of complaint. She worked until the sun sank low, her movements efficient and tireless. Then she would walk off the property, disappearing into the twilight as quietly as she had come. She carried no pack-stole glances only at her own worn-out boots, and never once offered him a word of thanks. He would leave her payment, a few coins, and a plate of food on a barrel by the barn door, and it would be gone when he returned. He walked among the stalls now, the air thick with the scent of hay and horse. He could hear the gentle, rhythmic scrape of her brush on wood as she scrubbed a water trough. He had watched her earlier, seen her tending to a mare he'd recently recovered from rustlers. The animal was skittish, its flanks striped with dried blood from a rough ride. The woman, he didn't even know her name, had approached the nervous horse, not with force, but with a stoic patience that stirred something unspoken in his chest. She had cleaned the wounds with a quiet focus, her touch gentle but firm, and the mare had stood for her, calmed by her silent presence. Wade was a man accustomed to silence. His ranch was a sprawling, isolated kingdom where his only companions were his cattle and the wind. He had bought the land 15 years ago, seeking refuge from a world that had felt too loud, too crowded. He had built the house and the barn with his own 2 hands, his life a testament to self-reliance. But the woman's silence was different from his. His was a choice, a comfortable solitude. Hers felt like a fortress, a wall built to keep the world out. He wondered where she lived, how she ate on the days she wasn't here. What stories lay buried behind those distant, guarded eyes. She could not own a horse, he thought, or she would ride it. She likely did not own a bed. Yet she seemed to understand the dirt and the animals with an instinct that couldn't be taught. A woman like that who knew hardship so intimately, where did she come from? After the 5th day, his curiosity finally outweighed his ingrained hesitation to pry into another's affairs. Just before noon, he watched her leave the barn, heading not toward the main road, but toward the dense woods that bordered the eastern edge of his property. He waited a moment, then quietly vaulted the fence and followed, keeping a safe distance, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles. He felt a pang of guilt for intruding on her privacy, but the mystery of her was a puzzle he couldn't resist trying to solve. He had to know. The trail she took was not a trail at all, but a narrow deer path that wound its way through dense stands of lodgepole pines. Wade followed at a distance, his movements practiced and silent from years of tracking lost cattle. The path twisted over a rocky creek bed, the water whispering over smooth stones and through forgotten clearings where the sunlight dappled the forest floor. He kept his eyes fixed on her silhouette, a slim figure moving with a steady, determined pace that spoke of long familiarity with this hidden route. As twilight began to bleed through the trees, turning the world to shades of purple and gray, the woods opened into a small, secluded hollow. It was a place he'd never seen before, tucked away and sheltered by a ring of ancient pines. And there, half hidden beneath an old miner's tarp and leaning canvas walls, was a small, ramshackle shelter. It was little more than a collection of scavenged planks and branches, a desperate attempt to carve out a space against the wilderness. A thin, pale wisp of smoke curled from a crooked stovepipe, and the faint, flickering glow of a single lantern was visible through a gap in the canvas. Wade froze at the edge of the clearing, a cold knot forming in his stomach. She lives here, he thought, his mind struggling to comprehend the level of poverty, with no warmth except that tiny ember. What kind of life is that? He almost turned to leave, right then, his guilt sharp and stinging. This was her secret, her private world, and he was an intruder. He had no right to be here. But then a soft sound reached him, a sound so unexpected in that remote, desperate place that his breath caught in his throat. It was children's laughter, not the cries of hunger he might have expected, not the whimpering of cold and miserable souls, but a gentle, bright peal of laughter that trembled with an impossible innocence. He crouched behind a fallen log, his heart pounding, and peered through the dense foliage. Through a tear in the canvas wall he could see inside the shelter. And what he saw made his heart skip a beat. 4 small bodies moved about the cramped space. 2 boys, 2 girls, their faces thin, but lit with a spirit that defied their squalid surroundings. They were playing quietly around a low, smoky fire. One little girl, no more than 5, was chasing a moth that fluttered near the lantern, giggling as her small hands swatted at the air. The woman he knew only as a silent worker. He now knew her name was Evelyn. He'd heard one of the boys say it stood at the center of this small universe. She gently lifted the giggling girl into her arms, smoothing her tangled hair with a tenderness Wade had never imagined she possessed. The fierce, guarded woman from his barn was transformed into a mother, her face softened by love. As she set the child down, the little girl stumbled her bare foot, hitting a hidden rock on the dirt floor. She didn't cry, but her eyes widened in surprise. In an instant, Evelyn's arms were around her, pulling her close, kissing her head, and whispering words of comfort too low for him to hear. The other children paused their game and looked toward the opening of the shelter. They saw something, a flicker of movement in the trees where he was hiding. One of the older boys tensed, but he did not cry out. Instead, he simply watched, his gaze filled with a fierce, protective instinct. In that moment, Evelyn looked up, her dark, weary eyes scanning the tree line and meeting his. There was no surprise in her gaze, only a deep, bone-weary resignation. The distance between employer and servant, between his world and hers, collapsed in that raw, silent exchange. She had 4 lives depending on her, and whatever her past, she had built this fragile refuge from the wild with her own 2 hands. He had trespassed on their safety. He had exposed them. He released the breath he had been holding, a white plume in the cold evening air. He realized with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity that they would never be safe alone. The Wyoming winter was coming, and this makeshift shelter would be no match for its fury. He rose from behind the log, dusting pine needles from his coat, and stepped into the clearing. The firelight caught his profile, a silent witness to their silent lives. He had come seeking an answer, but instead he had found a world he did not know. He needed a world of shadows, embers, and quiet, desperate heroism. And as the little girl nestled further into Evelyn's arms, he made a decision. He would not turn away. The mornings had begun to carry the sharp bite of frost in their breath, a clear promise of the coming winter. Wade Callahan rose earlier now, not because the ranch needed it, but because something inside him stirred before the light did. The image of the barefoot little girl in the hidden hollow, her innocent giggle echoing in the cold air, would not leave his mind. The thought of them, huddled under a leaky tarp as the temperatures dropped, was a constant nagging ache in his chest. The morning after his discovery, Wade rode out before the sun crested the mountains. He carried a heavy sack of flour and a thick slab of salted pork. He didn't ride to the hollow. He respected her privacy too much for that. Instead, he hung the provisions from a sturdy nail on the outside of his own woodshed, a place he knew she would pass on her way to the barn. He tucked a small folded note beneath the twine of the flour sack. It read simply, "For the children." He did not wait to see if she took it. He simply left it there and went about his morning chores, a strange mixture of hope and anxiety churning within him. That day, Evelyn arrived at the barn, as she always did, silent, and leaned her hair pinned back beneath a fraying bonnet. She worked with her usual practiced efficiency, her eyes low, her steps soundless on the hay-strewn floor. If she had seen the provisions, she gave no sign. She scrubbed, swept, and mucked out the stalls, her face an unreadable mask of stoicism. When the day's chores were done and she had gone, Wade returned to the tack room. The sack of flour and the pork were gone. He felt a surge of relief, but next to where they had been placed neatly on the workbench lay a single silver coin, her wages from the previous day, and a piece of paper folded into a neat square. He picked it up, his calloused fingers fumbling with the delicate paper. Her handwriting was small and even the letters carefully formed. "Please do not give again. I work to live. I do not beg." He read the note twice, a lump rising in his throat. It was not a rejection of his help, but an assertion of her dignity. She was not a charity case. He folded the note carefully and placed it in the top drawer of his desk beneath a collection of old tools and receipts. He said nothing to her the next time they crossed paths. He understood. But the day after, he left something different by the woodshed. Not food, not money, but a thick, clean hand towel folded and tied with a piece of twine. It was a simple, practical thing, something a woman with 4 children could always use. It was a gift, not a handout. When he checked that evening, it was gone. That was all the reply he needed. 2 days passed. Then, one quiet afternoon, as Wade was checking the fence line near the main house, he heard a soft knock at his front door. He walked around to find a boy standing there. He was 10, maybe 11, with skin freckled from the sun. Dark hair falling into his eyes and a small woven basket clutched tightly in his hands. It was her eldest. "You're the one who gave my mama the towel?" The boy asked, his voice quiet but steady. Wade leaned on the doorframe, looking down at the serious young face. "I suppose I am." The boy hesitated, then held out the basket like a sacred offering. "She said I should bring these," he said. "Said it's not right to take and not give." Wade looked down at the basket. Inside, nestled carefully amongst scraps of cloth, were 6 eggs still smudged with straw. A wave of emotion, thick and unfamiliar, washed over him. "You got a name, son?" The boy nodded. "James." "Well, James." Wade said, his voice a little rough. "You tell your mother I said thank you, and you tell her I didn't give anything to get something back. I gave because I wanted to." James studied him for a long moment, his young eyes filled with an old soul's gravity, as if trying to decide if Wade meant it. Then he nodded again, satisfied, and turned to go, disappearing back down the path toward the woods. That night, Wade sat by the fire longer than usual, staring into the flickering orange and thinking not of his ranch, but of 4 children huddled together under a leaky roof, and the woman who held their world together with silence, stitches, and an unbreakable pride. The next morning, he found a strip of old muslin cloth tied to the fence post by the barn. On it, embroidered in small, careful blue letters, were 4 names: James, Clara, Lily, and Sam. He didn't untie it. He just stood there, his hand resting on the weathered wood, letting the cold wind lift his coat, and whispered to no one, "Well, now I know who I'm working for." Under a sky, the color of rusted iron, the clouds clamped tight around the mountains like clenched fists. An ominous greenish light filtered through the pines, and the air grew still and heavy. Wade stood on the porch of the horse barn, coiling a length of rope with steady, practiced hands, but his eyes stayed fixed on the trail that disappeared into the woods. A storm was coming, a bad one. He could feel it in the ache of his bones and in the nervous energy of the horses shifting in their stalls. Something in his gut twisted an instinct he could not shake. For weeks now, he had been quietly reinforcing the barn, a silent project running parallel to Evelyn's daily chores. He had replaced rotted boards in the stalls, fixed the stubborn hinges on the main doors, and patched the section of the roof that had always leaked during heavy rains. Evelyn never asked for it. She said nothing when she noticed the repairs, just kept scrubbing the stalls and sweeping the feed aisle as before. But Wade noticed the small things. He saw how she would sometimes run her fingers across the smooth new planks as she passed. He saw her pause once when she noticed the sturdy new hook he'd nailed near the door just for her coat. These were their silent conversations. Every time he tried to slip her a little more money with her wages the next morning, he would find the extra coins returned sitting on the workbench with a note written in the same small, careful hand. "You've done enough. Don't carry what's not yours." Wade never argued. He just folded the notes and placed them in the top drawer of his desk where they joined the growing stack, a silent ledger of her refusal and her pride. That afternoon, the hail came. It started, without warning, a sudden violent roar as ice stones the size of marbles began to pelt the ground. The sound on the barn roof was deafening, a furious drumming that sent the horses into a panic, their eyes wide with terror. Wade did not wait. He threw on his thickest coat, pulled his hat low against the onslaught, and saddled his most sure-footed horse without a word. The path to the hollow would be a treacherous mess of mud and ice, but he rode hard, his jaw set the wind and hail stinging his face. When he reached the clearing, the sight made his chest go still. The makeshift shelter was in ruins. The tarp roof had been shredded by the ice and had caved in on one side, a canvas wing, torn and flapping uselessly in the wind like a broken bird. Smoke no longer drifted from the crooked stovepipe. One of the shutters, made from a scavenged crate lid, had broken loose and swung wildly in the storm, slapping against the wood like a frantic, desperate warning. Wade dismounted and pushed open the makeshift door. Inside, the cold hit him first, a damp, bone-chilling cold that smelled of wet earth and fear. Then he saw them. The 4 children were curled together like a litter of pups beneath a pile of threadbare quilts, their small bodies pressed together for warmth. The smallest, a girl no older than 3, whimpered softly, but did not cry. Beside them, Evelyn sat slumped against the wall, her body a shield. Blood smeared her temple from where a fallen beam had struck her. Her arms were still spread, as if even in her dazed state she was trying to shield them from everything the world could throw. "Evelyn?" Wade said, his voice low and steady to keep it from shaking. She blinked slowly, her eyes trying to focus on him through a haze of pain. She did not speak. Wade didn't wait for permission. He knelt and gathered the smallest child, Sam, into one arm, then reached for another. "We're going," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "All of you. Now." The two oldest, James and Clara, helped each other up, their faces pale and stunned, but their movements quiet and obedient. Wade shifted his weight, cradling the baby tighter, then looked at Evelyn again. "Come on." She hesitated for only a second, a flicker of her stubborn pride warring with the raw reality of their situation. Then she rose shakily to her feet, blood matting her dark hair. She didn't argue, didn't ask where they were going. She just followed. Back at the ranch, Wade threw open the door to the main cabin, his cabin, a place that had known only his solitary presence for 15 years. The fire in the main hearth, which he always kept banked, roared to life as he threw on fresh logs. The room filled with a warm, steady glow. He didn't say a word, just gestured toward the hearth. The children drifted in their eyes round with a mixture of fear and awe, their small feet dragging with exhaustion. Wade set the youngest down gently on the old bearskin rug before the fire, then stepped into the kitchen. He returned with a tin cup of milk warmed on the stove. The little girl, her cheeks red from the cold, her hair sticking to her forehead, looked up at him. Wade knelt, holding out the cup without a word. She reached for it with both small hands. Behind her, Evelyn stood as still as stone, soaked and shivering, watching him with a gaze that said everything she couldn't find the words for. And Wade, who had lived 10 winters in that cabin without company, without laughter, without even another voice at the table, realized something quiet but deep. This wasn't charity. This wasn't obligation. This was the first time in a very long time that his house had felt like it was waiting for someone to come home. Dawn's first light crept through the gaps in the cabin walls, pale and relentless, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Evelyn stirred on the small cot Wade had set up for her near the hearth. Her head pounded from the cold, and the blow she'd taken, and flashes of the previous night's rescue came back to her. The terrifying sound of hail pounding the rickety roof, the sharp crack of the collapsing beam, the children curled under thin blankets, and Wade's quiet, unshakable authority as he led them through the storm. She sat up, her muscles stiff and aching. Across the room, the children were huddled together under a single thick quilt on Wade's own bed, their breathing soft and even. A wave of profound gratitude washed over her, so intense it was painful, but it was immediately followed by a surge of panic. Holding her breath, she feared waking them, and she feared staying. This warmth, this safety was a debt she could never repay, and the weight of it was suffocating. Morning stretched its fingers across the room as Evelyn moved silently to the wooden crate that served as her trunk, the one Wade had brought back from the ruined shelter. She began stuffing their few meager belongings inside worn cloth scraps, a few precious coins she had saved, and the bundle of handwritten notes she'd kept from Wade, updates on her life that said more than she ever could aloud. Tucking in the clean hand towel he'd left for her a week ago, she tied the bundle tight, her fingers trembling. Tears she hadn't shed during the storm now wet her cheeks. She could not burden this man. Not again. At the back door, frost crusted the threshold. Evelyn paused before stepping into the biting chill. Clutching her bundle, she turned and found Wade standing motionless in the doorway, blocking her path. He had been waiting. The children were still asleep behind him, but he was awake, a silent guardian. His silence felt like a wall in accusation. Finally, her own voice broke the stillness, hushed and brittle. "I'm sorry, Mr. Callahan, but I can't." Her eyes dropped to the floorboards. You've done too much already. If I stay, people will talk. You're a landowner, a good man. Folks notice things." She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "They'll say I'm taking advantage, that I'm dragging you into disgrace. I won't let that happen to you." Tears glistened in her eyes, threatening to fall. A loose board creaked under Wade's weight. Neither of them moved. Then he stepped forward, his shoulders steady, his expression serious. "Evelyn," he said calmly, the first time he had spoken her name with such directness. "I've lived out here 15 years. I've heard what folks think. I've gotten used to their rumors." He paused, a flicker of old pain crossing his features. "But I've never had soup warmed for me after a long day. Never had someone care enough to wipe a smudge of soot from my shoulder when the cold set in." He reached out and gently took her cold fingers in his large, warm hand. "They need you," he said simply, his gaze shifting to the sleeping children. "Not because you're running, but because you give them some place to run to." Evelyn looked at his hand, steady and strong around hers. She pressed her palm against his, her voice trembling. "I'm tired," she whispered. "So tired of hiding. Tired of being afraid every time someone knocks on the door." Tears finally slipped down her cheeks. "I don't want to bring those fears here. The kids deserve peace, and I'm not sure I can give it to them." Wade closed his hand over hers, lacing their fingers together. "Then stay," he replied, his voice deeper, now resolute. "Stay for them. Stay because here you don't have to run. Not with me." He opened the door wide, not for her to leave, but as an invitation to stay. The gesture was simple, yet profound. They're asleep now, but when they wake, they'll need someone who stays. Someone who doesn't vanish when things get hard. For a long moment, she simply breathed the warmth of his hand spreading up her arm. The children stirred in the other room, soft sighs and shifting limbs. Evelyn mourned her solitary past, the cold roads, the colder nights, the crushing silence. But these 4 children needed her, and this man, this quiet, stubborn man, did too. This felt like belonging, not charity. Tears dripped from her chin as she spoke, her voice small but clear. "All right," she whispered. "I'll stay." She pressed her hand to her chest. "I'll stay for them, and for you." She flinched slightly at the admission, the vulnerability of it. He closed the distance between them, gently brushing a lock of damp hair from her neck. Wade nodded, his eyes soft. "Then let's start again," he said, reaching for the bundle in her other hand. "One day at a time." She let him take it, her lips trembling into a fragile smile. The cabin door closed behind them as they stepped back inside, the children asleep, unaware of the decision that would shape their future. The silence that followed felt different, not empty, but whole. Evelyn moved to the hearth and stoked the dying embers, expecting him to leave her to her thoughts. But he stayed kneeling beside her, pulling the quilt tighter around the youngest child. She hesitated, her heart hammering, then reached out her free hand, finding his. They sat together in the glowing hearth light, quiet and determined, watching the fire take hold of the dry wood. Outside, the wind howled, but inside something stronger was rising. Evelyn closed her eyes and exhaled. She would stay. Here, darkness had met light. Here, she belonged. Dusk had turned the skies into a smear of bruised purple and fading gold when the sound of unfamiliar hooves broke the hard-won quiet of the ranch. Wade stepped out from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, his eyes narrowing at the 3 silhouettes approaching from the edge of the trail. They were not neighbors. One man rode with a slouched arrogance, a smirk almost visible from yards away. Wade recognized him before he could even dismount, a cold dread settling in his stomach. The man swung down from his horse with too much confidence, his boot heels hitting the dirt like gunshots. His hat hung low over greasy hair, but nothing could disguise the swagger. It was Cal Rourke, Evelyn's husband in name and nothing more. "Well, well, Callahan." Cal drawled, his voice slick with false congeniality. "Heard you've been sheltering what used to be mine." Wade's voice was steady, hard as the iron on his anvil. "She's not yours, and she's not property." Cal shrugged a dismissive gesture. "Didn't come for her. Hell, I don't want the woman. She's too broke to be useful." He grinned, revealing cracked yellowed teeth. "But those kids," he said, his eyes glinting with greed. "4 of them. That's money I could use. $100 apiece. You give me that, and I'll be out of your hair for good." Behind him, the 2 other men, hired shadows with broad chests and empty eyes, watched silently, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. Wade stepped off the porch, his movement slow and deliberate. "You come onto my land with threats and a price tag on children. You won't leave the same way." Cal chuckled and pulled a folded, grimy paper from his coat. "Got birth certificates," he said, waving it tauntingly. "Got their names, my name. You don't have any of that. She ran, remember, no court papers, no proof of desertion, just her word against mine. You give me the money, I disappear, or the law takes 'em back for me." Wade's jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. "There's no law in this county that protects a man like you." "You sure about that?" Cal asked, his voice turning venomous. "I could walk into town right now and claim every damn kid she's hiding in your house. What'll you do then, huh? Shoot me in front of the sheriff?" From the porch door, Evelyn appeared. She didn't scream, didn't plead. She stood with her fists clenched at her sides and her shoulders squared, a pillar of defiance. "They'll never go with you," she said, her voice low and trembling with fury. "Not even if I have to hide for the rest of my life." Cal sneered at her. "You think hiding behind this broken-down rancher makes you safe? Come on, darling. It's $100. That's cheap for 4 mouths to feed." Wade stepped between them, shielding her. "That's enough." And then the first punch came. It wasn't from Cal, but from one of his thugs who lunged at Wade, catching him hard across the jaw. The second man followed immediately, and Wade, caught off guard, fell backward into the dirt. Evelyn screamed, rushing forward, but Cal grabbed her wrist and shoved her down hard. "You think I won't take them right now?" he snarled, raising a hand to her. Before the second blow could land on Wade, a gunshot rang out sharp and clear in the evening air. "Let her go, Cal." The voice came from behind the fence line. Jed Weaver, a neighboring rancher whose land bordered Wade's to the north, stood with a rifle raised and leveled, his wife beside him, a heavy revolver held steady in her hands. They had been on their way to return a stray calf and had seen the riders approach. Their eyes burned with a cold, neighborly fury. "This ain't your business, Jed." Cal growled, his confidence faltering. Jed cocked the rifle, the sound loud and final. "It is now." The 2 thugs backed away first. They were hired muscle, not men willing to die for Cal Rourke's schemes. One muttered something under his breath and turned his horse. The other followed suit. Cal cursed, realizing he was alone and outgunned. "You'll regret this, Callahan," he spat. "No," Jed said, his voice calm and deadly. "You will." Cal mounted his horse and galloped off, dust and rage trailing behind him. Silence returned to the yard, broken only by Wade's labored breathing as he pushed himself up from the dirt. Evelyn dropped to her knees beside him, her hands gently cradling his face. "You're bleeding," she whispered, her fingers tracing the cut on his cheek. He managed a crooked, painful smile. That's what happens when you fight bastards. You should have stayed back, she said, tears finally brimming in her eyes. This wasn't your burden to carry. He looked up at her, his eyes bruised but clear and calm. If it's not for you and them, he said, his voice rough, then who the hell is it for? He reached up and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Yes, I did. Behind them, the 4 children peeked through the window, their faces small and pale, wide-eyed and silent. Evelyn looked at them, then back at Wade. They'll never forget this, she whispered. Neither will I, he said. And, in the dying light, with blood in the dust and a fire of righteous anger in her chest, Evelyn knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about home, and she would fight for it. The courtroom in Cheyenne felt too bright, too clean a sterile world away from the dusty, hard-won life Evelyn had carved out for her family. She stood before the judge's bench in a plain dress she had sewn herself, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Behind her, in the first row of benches, her children sat like small silent shadows, James's arm protectively around his younger sister Lily. Wade stood off to the side, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his jaw set a silent, unmovable pillar of support. Across the aisle, Cal Rourke lounged with a smirk, his greasy hair combed back, looking confident next to his slick town lawyer. The judge, a man with a weary face and tired eyes, shuffled through a stack of papers. Mrs. Rourke, he began, his voice dry, your husband has presented birth records with his name as the father. Do you have any legal documentation of custody or separation? Evelyn's voice cracked as she spoke. No, sir. He never let me sign anything. No school papers, no doctor forms. I just kept them alive. Cal leaned forward, his voice oozing false sincerity. She kidnapped them, Your Honor. Ran off like a thief in the night. I've got their birth records, my name's on everyone. She's been hiding them from their legal father. She protected them. Wade interjected, his voice a low growl. Let's keep it civil, Mr. Callahan. The judge warned, his gaze sharp. Evelyn took a deep, shaky breath, forcing herself to speak. I didn't run to hide them, Your Honor. I ran because he hurt me, because he drank away every cent we had, because I couldn't let my children grow up afraid of the sound of every slammed door. But her words, filled with the desperate truth of her life, seemed small and insignificant in that cold room. The law wanted ink and signatures, not bruises and fear. The judge sighed, looking from Evelyn's earnest face to the legal documents in front of him. Without supporting documents or a witness to your claims, Mrs. Rourke, my hands are tied. A chair scraped loudly in the back of the courtroom. I'll testify. A frail voice, thin but clear as a bell, broke the heavy silence. Everyone turned. An old woman, her back bent with age but her eyes sharp and clear, stood up steadying herself on a cane. It was Esther Whitlock, a reclusive woman who lived on a small ridge overlooking the hollow where Evelyn had first made her shelter. I've lived on that ridge for 62 years, Esther said, her voice gaining strength. I saw what happened. I heard it. The judge nodded for her to proceed. Esther pointed a trembling but steady finger at Cal. That man, she said, came to her shelter last year. He didn't come looking for his children. He came looking for money. He told her he didn't want her, just the money the children were worth. Said they were worth more sold off separate. Called her a hole that had dried up. I heard it all. She didn't know I was there listening from the trees, but I was. The room fell silent. Cal's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. His lawyer began to object, but the judge waved him into silence. He looked at Evelyn, then at the papers again, and his weary expression hardened. His voice was firm when he delivered the verdict. This court grants full and sole guardianship of the children, James, Clara, Lily, and Sam, to their mother, Evelyn Rourke, effective immediately. Mr. Rourke, your petition is denied. Evelyn exhaled a breath she felt like she had been holding for years. Behind her, James squeezed Clara's hand, and Wade allowed himself a single, sharp nod of relief. It was over, or so they thought. They arrived home at sundown, the wagon crunching over the familiar gravel. The ranch looked quiet. Too quiet. Then they saw it. The new chicken coop they had all worked so hard to build was smashed, torn apart, its fresh lumber splintered. Feathers were scattered across the dirt like snow. The chickens were gone. And on the barn door, 3 words were scrolled in black soot, "You lose." Wade stared his face, turning to granite. Then, without a word, he turned and headed for the stable. "Where are you going?" Evelyn asked, her heart sinking. He met her gaze, a cold fire in his eyes. "To do what I should have done weeks ago." She did not try to stop him. That night, while the children slept curled together in one bed safe, at last Evelyn sat on the porch, wrapped in Wade's coat, waiting. The stars blinked above in a cold, clear sky. The wind held its breath. Hours later, she heard the sound of a single horse approaching. Wade dismounted, dust clinging to him like a second skin. "They got him," he said, his voice tired but final. "Lincoln County Sheriff is holding him. Attempted extortion, trespass, and animal cruelty. Maybe more this time." Evelyn pressed a hand to her mouth, blinking back tears of relief. Wade stepped closer. "It's over now, Evelyn, for good." She looked up at the star-filled sky. "No," she whispered. "It's just beginning." He nodded, and together they stepped inside, not into a house filled with fear, but into something they could finally truly call home. The morning sun spilled gold over the pasture, the kind of light that made everything feel new and possible. Wade stood beside Evelyn and the children as they worked on rebuilding the chicken coop. The one Cal had destroyed was a pile of splintered wood, but the bones of something sturdier now rose in its place. The air, which had so recently been filled with tension and fear, now rang with the sounds of productive work and quiet joy. The children passed nails, held boards steady, and chased each other with the kind of carefree energy that only returns when fear loosens its suffocating grip. Lisa, the eldest, now 12, checked the level of the roosting bar with the seriousness of a seasoned carpenter. Nathan, his face smudged with dirt, took immense pride in hammering every nail straight and true. Tommy hummed softly to himself as he worked, and little Anna, barefoot and still smudged with flour from breakfast, sat in the grass pretending to feed a flock of invisible hens. The wind carried the smell of fresh-cut cedar and something softer, something that smelled like peace. As Wade adjusted the new door hinges, Anna toddled over and tugged at Evelyn's apron. "Mama," she whispered, her voice small and hopeful, but loud enough for Wade to hear. "Can we stay here forever?" Evelyn's hand stilled on the coop frame. She looked toward Wade, who was wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his glove. A flicker of the old uncertainty crossed her face before she answered gently, "That depends if Mr. Wade's okay with us making a home of his place." Wade turned, his eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. "If I'm okay with it," he said, his voice warm. He looked at the children, at their earnest, busy faces. Then his gaze settled on Evelyn. "From now on," he said, his voice clear and certain, "this place belongs to all of us." Nathan let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for weeks. Lisa smiled without looking up from her hammer. Evelyn's shoulders, which she had held squared and tense for so long, finally dropped, and in that moment something inside her that had been coiled tight for years began to unfold. Later that evening, the coop stood complete, a small, sturdy monument to their shared effort. The children scattered toward the porch, tired but beaming, their laughter lingering in the twilight. Evelyn stayed behind, brushing sawdust from her skirt. Wade stood beside her, his arms crossed, watching the sun slip behind the ridge. She did not speak at first, just stood in the quiet, letting it settle around her like something earned. Then she reached for his hand, not to take it, but gently placing hers on top of it where it rested on the fence rail. He didn't move, just looked down at her fingers. Strong, scarred, and unshaking. "I know I've been here a while," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "But I still feel like I'm borrowing this life." "You're not borrowing anything, Evelyn," he said, his voice firm. "You've built it." Her own voice caught slightly. If it's all right, I'd like to stop knocking. Stop feeling like I'm just passing through." She took a breath. "I want the children to have something that's real." She continued, her voice gaining strength. "A name that means safety, not shame." Wade turned to face her, fully, his eyes never leaving hers. "If it's all right," she said, quieter now, her vulnerability laid bare. "I'd like to carry your name, not because I have to, but because I want to. I'd like to be Evelyn Callahan." The wind stirred again, brushing loose strands of hair from her face. Wade didn't answer with words. He just lifted her hand from the railing, turned it over, and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss into her palm. Then he lifted his other hand and rested it against her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. He nodded. A quiet promise, more binding than any vow spoken before a preacher. That night, as the lantern flickered low and the fire crackled in the hearth, Wade sat at the big wooden table with the children gathered around, each drawing on scrap paper with bits of charcoal, making plans for a garden come spring. Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching her family. Not borrowed, not temporary, not running. Her family. And she did not need to knock anymore. She was home.